Alright guys, so today we are going to talk about how corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So let's look at the first example so we understand what that means. So in the first example it says that triangle HEY, so it's this one right here, is congruent to triangle MAN. And we want to know how it's congruent, or by what property. So we've got an angle, and a side. Since this side is not in between the two angles, it's not angle side angle. So we can only do angle side angle if that side, congruent side, is in between the two angles. Since it's not, it's angle angle side. So we're going to write that here. And now what we want to do is list out the corresponding parts that are congruent in addition to these angles and this one side. So let's look. We've already marked off our angles here. We've already marked off this angle, so we have one last angle, so we'll start there. So this angle H is going to correspond to angle M. So we will write that as our first congruency statement. Now let's look at our sides. So we know that EH is congruent to AM, but since these two triangles are congruent, side HY and side MN are corresponding parts of congruent triangles. So they are congruent as well. So we can go ahead and write that statement as well. And then lastly, our third side. So side EY is going to be congruent to side AN. So that is what we mean by corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, which, as you can see, is abbreviated a lot to just Cpctc. Less to write in our proofs. Alright, let's look at the next example. So we'll do our proof. So I'm going to go ahead and mark our given information on our figure because for me it just is a little bit better visually if I can see what this says. So if I know that side AC is congruent to side AR, so I'm going to mark that AC is congruent to AR. And as you can see, that's our first statement down here. And the reason we were able to write that is it was given to us. That was our given information. Next, we're given that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So this angle here is congruent to this angle right here. So that is our second statement that we can make about the two figures. And as you can see, the reason is that it's given. We've already filled in that answer. Alright, the next statement says that angle CAL, so CAL is going to be that angle right there, is going to be congruent to angle RAS, so RAS. Now, how do we know that these two angles are congruent? We have to think back a little bit and remember vertical angles. So vertical angles are congruent. So that is what allows us to make that statement right there. Our fourth statement says that the two triangles are congruent. Triangle LCA, this one here on the left, and triangle SRA, this one on the right, are congruent. And we know that because we've got angle, angle, side. So we've got two angles, and two sides that are congruent. So that is our reason. And then lastly, we can now make the statement that is what we're trying to prove, that angle 3 and angle 4 are congruent because they are congruent parts of congruent triangles, so they are congruent. So that's Cpctc. Alright, let's look at example 3. It gives us the information that angles NLM and angle LNO are congruent. So that is NLM is this one right here, and it is going to be congruent to angle LNO, so this one right there. So as you can see, it's already been filled in for our first statement, and the reason is that it is given. The next piece of information that we know is that angle OLN, so OLN, so this one up here, is congruent to angle MNL, so MNL, so this one down here. These two angles are congruent. So that's going to be our next statement that we write, OLN congruent to angle MNL. L, and the reason for that is it's given. So now the next statement is blank, but the reason is given. So it says reflexive property. So if we look up here, when we talk about reflexive property, it would be this segment Ln. So Ln is going to be congruent to itself. So we have segment Ln congruent to segment NL. And then our fourth statement is a triangle congruency statement. It says that triangle LMN, so LMN, this one that's kind of on the top here, is congruent to this triangle that's on the bottom. So when we write that name for that triangle that's on this bottom, we want to make sure that our letters correspond correctly. So if L is listed first, this angle here, we want to write the first corresponding angle for this other triangle, so that's going to be N. And then angle M up here corresponds to angle O, so O would be the second one we write, and then angle N here corresponds to angle L. And so if we look at our figure, we can see that we have angle, side, angle. And then lastly, our final statement is just what we're trying to prove. Angle M is congruent to angle O. So those two are congruent because they are congruent parts of congruent triangles, so they are congruent. Alright, the last example that we're going to go over, and it looks like we cut off a little bit in this when I printed it, so let's fix that. Okay. So angle A is congruent to angle D, which is this one up here. And we can go ahead and write that down as our first statement. And the reason is given. Then the second statement that we can write, this given information, is that segment AE, so this segment here, is congruent to segment ED. So these two segments are congruent. So we can write that statement as well. And that is given information. And now we're trying to prove that this segment AB is congruent to segment CD. So if we can show that these two triangles are congruent, then we can make that statement because it would be corresponding parts of congruent triangles. So we've got an angle, a side, and if we can show that these two angles are congruent, then the two triangles would be congruent. So we know these are congruent because they are vertical angles. So angle AEB is congruent to angle DEC. That is vertical angles. And so now that we have angle, side, angle, we can say that triangle AEB is congruent to triangle DEC. And that is by angle, side, angle. And if these two triangles are congruent, then now we know that AB and DC are congruent. Because they are corresponding parts of congruent triangles, and they are congruent. Alright guys, hope this helps with your homework.